Out of the shadows, breaking the cycle of narcissistic abuse. The systemic mechanics of intergenerational trauma and the biological imperative of going no contact. This is the path to growth and transformation.
The narcissistic family system uses the scapegoat as a biological sacrifice to preserve its false image. Going no contact is not betrayal, but a necessity to stop intergenerational trauma.
The activation filter traps us in the fog, fear, obligation, and guilt. As long as we filter through them, we remain tethered to trauma. To escape, we must find clarity beyond the fog. The subtle contrast between dysfunction and pathology. In a typical dysfunctional family, the harm is unintentional. In a narcissist-headed family, the abuse is intentional and hidden. One can heal together, while the other requires a scapegoat. Adversity leaves a biological imprint. Trauma hardwires neural pathways in the brain. It traps the body in constant fight or flight, and weakens the immune system, increasing disease risk.
Your blueprint for recovery. Starting with Section 1, the reality of discard.
Because, let's be honest, the end of a toxic relationship rarely brings instant peace, does it? It brings a profound shock and this agonizing sense of betrayal. It's literally a shock and awe maneuver. Abusers rarely end things respectfully. The rug gets completely pulled out from under you. But the kicker is, they often don't even view it as truly over. They're just placing you on the back burner while they go secure a new target.
To really understand the discard, we have to look at the entire chronological cycle of abuse. It always starts with idealization or love bombing. Now, this initial charm isn't genuine love. Actually, it's a calculated bait tactic. It lures you into an impossible imaginary contract. And when you inevitably fail to meet these unspoken conditions, the devaluation begins. This is your gaslighting, your silent treatment. Finally, the cycle culminates in the discard, where you're suddenly dropped, often because, you guessed it, they've already lined up someone new.
And this brilliantly illustrates that concept. During that initial idealization phase, you are placed on this remarkably high pedestal. But here's the catch. That pedestal is actually located in a dark, sunken place, completely disconnected from reality and true intimacy. You are essentially set up to fall from the very beginning.
Moving to Section 2, unmasking narcissistic supply.
It's time to pull back the curtain here, kind of like the Wizard of Oz, to strip away the emotional confusion. The cold, mechanical engine driving all of this behavior is something called narcissistic supply. An abuser isn't driven by empathy or genuine connection. No, they are driven by an intense, rigid loyalty to a manufactured false self-image. And to protect that illusion, they have to extract supply from you to use as fuel.
As you can see, these relationships are frankly coldly transactional. Take your reactionary energy, for example. Your anger, your tears, your confusion. By intentionally provoking you, the abuser gets to stand back and look cool, calm, and collected by comparison. It perfectly validates their power and upholds their false image entirely at your expense.
All right, Section 3, the neuroscience of trauma bonds. Now, if you've ever severely judged yourself for wanting to go back, please listen to me. Returning is not a weakness. It's rooted in biology, not a character flaw. Your nervous system has quite literally been trained to crave the abuser. The intense withdrawal you feel, it closely mirrors breaking a severe chemical dependency.
It is a total chemical roller coaster. The abuse and the stress of separation cause a massive spike in cortisol. That's your stress hormone. Then, out of nowhere, the abuser returns with sudden affection, apologies, little breadcrumbs of warmth. Boom. That triggers a flood of oxytocin, the bonding hormone. Over time, your brain learns a devastating equation. The exact person causing your severe pain is simultaneously the only one who relieves it.
In psychology, this is known as intermittent reinforcement. Because the abuser alternates between cruelty and affection completely unpredictably. Your brain's reward system lights up exactly like someone playing a slot machine in Vegas. Unpredictable rewards trigger much stronger dopamine releases than consistent ones. And that makes the trauma bond incredibly resistant to breaking, because your brain is constantly scanning for that next hit of warmth.
Next up, Section 4, Hoovering and Crazy-Making Tactics. So the crucial point is, because narcissists essentially view you as property and constantly recycle partners for supply, hoovering is always a lingering threat. They desperately want to vacuum you right back into the dysfunction, effectively resetting the abuse from the very beginning. Ever wonder why they hoover the absolute hardest when you finally try to walk away? It's simple. When you threaten to leave in anger, your heightened emotion just confirms their power. But when you genuinely leave with calm detachment, you inflict a massive narcissistic injury. Your indifference dismantles their control, and that triggers their most aggressive, desperate attempts to pull you back. And to get you back, they will unleash a whole arsenal of chaotic tactics. They might use the loving return, just flooding you with affection, or manufactured crises, sudden health or financial emergencies to exploit your sympathy. Interestingly, our sources mention the one-down method. This is where they intentionally parade a new partner who seems like a massive downgrade just to confuse you and make you obsess. They also use triangulation and recruit flying monkeys, third parties who unknowingly do their dirty work. Explicitly naming these crazy-making tactics is the absolute key to stripping them of their invisible power. Now, if you share children or a workplace and you simply cannot go fully no contact, your absolute best defense is the gray rock method. This means becoming as uninteresting and boring as a literal gray rock. You provide brief, factual answers with zero emotional content. By doing this, you completely cut off the reactionary drama the abuser uses as their supply. You make yourself utterly useless to their cycle.
Finally, Section 5, the blueprint for recovery.
You are no longer just the survivor. You are the architect of your own life now. To rebuild, we highly recommend the 3-3-3 framework. First, establish cognitive clarity by dismantling the gaslighting and seeing reality for what it is. Second, maintain emotional and physical discipline. Remember, taking care of your physical health stops the narcissist from tapping into your energy field. And third, enforce strict boundaries, ideally total, absolute no contact.
Let's move to and see how this builds. Organizing your thoughts and understanding priorities for holistic recovery is vital. Your top priority must be cultivating an independent support base. You need safe spaces and trusted people who are completely disconnected from the abuser's toxic web so you can regain that cognitive clarity. And within that safe support base, you must practice the alchemy of anger. Anger gets a really bad reputation, right? But it is simply a valid expression of witnessed injustice. You survived a terrible ordeal, and you must let that anger out safely. Suppressing it compromises your structural integrity and can genuinely manifest as serious physical health issues. Now, as you heal, you might see the abuser seemingly thriving and think, why hasn't the universe punished them yet? Our sources refer to the physics of vibrational logic. The universe doesn't judge right or wrong, it simply obliges energy. The abuser thrives because they move forward without remorse. So to counter this, you must stop focusing on their false successes. You have to redirect literally all of your passion and energy into your own vibrational shift, passionately choosing to thrive forward yourself. Which brings us to our final thought. The abuser's entire cycle relies on keeping you off-balanced and drained. But now you have the blueprint. So, will you remain trapped in their chaotic, sunken place, or will you take these tools, apply your free will, and step up as the architect of your own luminous recovery? Remember, true personal growth is the ultimate revenge, and your vibrant, independent life is waiting to be built.
Okay, it's time for a journal break. Take the next 60 seconds to journal. Critical question number 1. Why does my mind keep replaying the chaos, even if I am safe? Critical question 2. When you ruminate after a breakup or the ending of a relationship, what are you really saying is unsafe right now? Critical question 3. What would be safe instead? After you answer these critical questions, your answers will more than likely help you to gain more clarity about why the relationship ended, how you were impacted, and how you can continue to focus on thriving forward. You might feel like you are stuck in the sunken place now, but journaling can help you to realize how you got in the sunken place. Here are 3 focus tools to add to your journal. Tool number 1, challenge yourself to begin making choices that will bring about necessary change. You might find out that you are a powerful catalyst to a much-needed change. Try not to be afraid of taking on the opportunity of change. Tool number 2, remember that your life has purpose. This means that you're no longer an option for those who wish to have a toxic relationship with you. Your story continues to unfold. You are embarking upon your journey and learn from all that comes with it. Tool number 3, consider beginning a healthy lifestyle. When I tell you that my most challenging focus tool was tool number 1, it's an understatement. When you take a look at focus tools number 2 and 3, you might notice how both of these first takes a willingness to make a choice to change. When you're in pain, you might not have the confidence to make the choice to change. Challenging yourself to begin making choices that bring about necessary change equals personal growth. This is how the chains of transgenerational family curse cycles begin to break.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are diving deep into the architecture of inheritance, and we're going to peel back the wallpaper on familial trauma. We're using a frankly terrifyingly accurate architectural metaphor to figure out exactly how deep generational pain gets passed down, and more importantly, how you can actually stop it. If you've ever felt the lingering weight of your family's history pulling you down, well, you're in the right place. Let's get into it. Now think about this for a second. Have you ever had this feeling like you're carrying around a weight that just isn't totally yours? We're starting this journey right inside the Overlook Hotel from Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. But hold on, hit pause on the classic ghost story for a minute. We're looking at that unsettling feeling that the ghosts of your family's unresolved history are actively playing out in your own life today. It's not just in your head, and no, it is absolutely not a sign of weakness. All right, Section 1, the architecture of abuse. This is the facade versus the boiler room. To really wrap our heads around transgenerational trauma, we kind of have to look at the abusive home as a haunted hotel. On the outside, oh, there's this grand high society facade that just looks absolutely perfect to all the neighbors. But inside, it's a rotting, explosive boiler room of stagnated energy. And in this whole architecture of abuse, think about the snowstorm. It's not just some random weather event. It represents the deliberate social isolation that abusers use to trap their victims. It basically ensures that no fresh outside air can come in to clear out the toxicity, which leaves the volatile parent's narrative completely unchallenged. It's a total lockdown. Moving on to Section 2, epigenetics, the body score, and the biological reality of inherited pain. So generational trauma actually physically alters the biology of descendants. It creates literal molecular memories. Let's break down the mechanics here, because there's a big difference between inter- and transgenerational trauma. Intergenerational trauma happens across just a single gap, so parent to child. It relies on things you can see, like behavioral grooming and emotional silence, based on direct experience. But transgenerational trauma? Wow, that spans multiple generations. It literally bypasses direct environmental experience through physical changes in gene expression. What that means is, you actually inherit a biological expectation of threat. The trauma is already programmed in before you even step onto the playing field. The specific biological layer going on here is just fascinating. We're talking about DNA methylation and HPA axis dysregulation. Okay, that sounds like a lot, but what it basically means is that extreme stress can chemically modify how your genes, specifically stress regulatory genes like FKBP5 and NR3C1, how they regulate your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. The fundamental DNA sequence doesn't actually change, but the chemical switches on top of it get flipped. And this results in a permanent hair trigger stress response and a heightened cortisol sensitivity. that gets passed right down the family line. So your body is essentially keeping score for a game that started long before you were even born. But hey, listen up, because here is the most absolutely crucial, hopeful point of this entire explainer. While trauma modifies the epigenome, positive experiences and new safe environments can actually correct and reverse those genetic markers. Yes, you can literally rewrite this. You are not permanently hardwired for suffering. By doing things like relational therapy, somatic experiencing, and targeted modalities like EMDR, your biology can physically heal from the past. You can flip those switches back. This brings us to Section 3, the identified patient, or the scapegoat in the system. So you might be wondering, how exactly does a dysfunctional or maybe narcissistic family handle all this buried pain without actually facing it? Well, they project it. They create what's called an identified patient, or IP. This is the family's scapegoat. They are systematically chosen to be the living container for the system's unacknowledged shame, dysfunction, and dirty secrets. The family essentially demonizes this child in a really twisted attempt at righteous purification. They honestly believe that by dumping all their own rot onto this one person, the rest of the family gets to feel clean and normal. It's wild. But why this specific child, right? The clinical reality here completely flips the usual narrative on its head. The family story always says the child is flawed or broken. But the reality? This child is usually chosen because they're the strongest link. They are typically a highly intuitive empath possessing a high vibrational frequency. Their innate light and strong personality structure directly contradict the narcissistic parent's rigid, controlling rules. And that sets off all of the parent's unresolved psychological alarms. Basically, they're targeted precisely because they have the intuitive ability to read the room and see right through the family's toxic facade. All right, Section 4, terrifying transferences. We're reframing pathology as adaptation. So, growing up in that volatile, explosive boiler room environment forces the identified patient to develop some incredibly sophisticated behavioral adaptations. Let's bridge pop culture and clinical reality for a second using The Shining. Pop culture likes to view Danny's shining as this magical telepathy, and his mother Wendy as a weak, screamy victim. But if we look at it clinically, Danny's magic is actually severe hypervigilance. It's a radar developed by a traumatized kid to instantly read energy shifts and anticipate systemic violence. And Wendy, she is not weak. She is utilizing a highly calculated, utterly exhausting de-escalation strategy called anxious appeasement just to prevent the narcissist's fragile ego from blowing up. And you know Danny's imaginary friend, Tony? Clinically speaking, Tony isn't some creepy ghost possession. He is a dissociative shield. When the adults in the room utterly fail to provide a safe reality, a lonely, terrified child's brain has to step up. It creates an inner protector, a voice that warns them to hide because the caregivers can't even provide basic safety. It is an incredibly intelligent, brilliant survival adaptation. But you know, appeasement only goes so far. Eventually, the switch flips. Just like Wendy grabbing that baseball bat to take on a man twice her size the second she realizes her child is in immediate physical danger, there comes a defining moment for the survivor. They decisively choose actual safety over the whole illusion of the happy family. They move from exhausting emotional labor to active, decisive escape. And let me tell you, that takes immense courage. Escaping the hotel, though, that is really just the beginning. Why? Because of what researchers call terrifying transferences. Biological conditioning dictates that for the survivor, just the prospect of a healthy connection triggers a deep, conditioned fear of being hurt all over again. Because interconnectedness in their past was known to be deeply painful, simply establishing trust equals terror. The nervous system sounds a massive alarm even when a new relationship is actually perfectly safe. And finally, Section 5, becoming the master alchemist and breaking the generational cycle. The ultimate victory here comes when the scapegoated survivor steps completely out of the role of the identified patient and instead becomes the master alchemist, someone who can actually transmute all that toxic energy into resilience. Here's how you do it. First, you interrupt the legacy daily. You make a conscious, active choice not to pass on the pain. Second, research your ancestral lineage. This helps depersonalize the abuse and completely strips the family secrets of their power. Third, apply the gray rock technique. Starve those energy vampires of their supply by becoming as uninteresting and non-reactionary as a literal gray rock. And finally, reclaim your emotional safety and identity using the GPS technique, defining goals with purpose that drive star power. This lets you establish your own solid values outside of the family's enmeshment. You are not a human wastebasket for ancestral shame, and you are absolutely not bound by the epigenetic markers you inherited. Like we talked about, you have the real biological power to reverse them through healing modalities like EMDR and relational therapy, and create a permanent legacy of healing. You are a cycle breaker. So I'll leave you with this final thought. As you throw up the toxic script you were handed, what will be the very first sentence of your new story?
Out of the shadows, breaking the cycle of narcissistic abuse. The systemic mechanics of intergenerational trauma and the biological imperative of going no contact. This is the path to growth and transformation. The shining is hypervigilance. A confident ability is a metaphor for children in chaotic homes, sensing emotional danger long before it erupts. This is the dissociative shadow Tony, evidence of hypervigilance.
Jack, don't come any closer! Jack! Jack, please stop it!
Wendy, I'm home.
Trauma can alter how your genetic code is read. This trauma can be passed down through generations. Epigenetic changes modify gene expression, inheriting trauma without altering the DNA.
Have you ever felt like you're carrying around this heavy, invisible weight that just isn't entirely yours? You know, that constant buzzing anxiety, a feeling of always being on edge, or even just this deep confusion about your own identity that you can't trace back to your own experiences? If you're nodding along right now, I really want to validate that feeling for you. Because it's not just in your head, and it's absolutely not a sign of weakness. What you might be feeling are the very real physical and emotional echoes of transgenerational trauma. So let's dive right into this. In today's explainer, we're unpacking exactly how this trauma gets passed down, looking at some really fascinating clinical insights. But more importantly, we're going to figure out how we can finally break the generational family scapegoat cycle. Together, we'll uncover practical tools to help you understand this invisible inheritance, reclaim your true identity, and actually rewrite the ending to a story that started way before you were even born. To start, think about the Overlook Hotel from Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. But, okay, before you picture a haunted house, hit pause. We're not talking about ghosts here. Our sources use this building as this brilliant cinematic metaphor for the terrifyingly clinical reality of an abusive family system. It's basically a psychological roadmap of family dysfunction. It perfectly captures what happens when a family's pain is just left completely untreated and unresolved. Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with the architecture of abuse, look at the identified patient role, explore the biology of trauma, and then wrap up with reclaiming your emotional safety and writing your new epilogue. All right, Part 1, the architecture of abuse.
The absolute core dynamic of these families comes down to the facade versus the boiler room. On the outside, the family presents this grand, high society image, right? They're the perfect family to the neighbors. But internally, it's a totally different story. It's this rotting, isolating boiler room of volatile tension. And these abusive environments rely heavily on social isolation, which is represented by that massive snowstorm in the hotel metaphor, to make sure the abuser's narrative goes completely unchallenged, keeping the victims trapped in a totally twisted reality.
And when that boiler room of pain just isn't dealt with, we get what's clinically known as transgenerational trauma. Basically, it's a multi-generational family heirloom of unresolved pain that's passed invisibly from ancestors to offspring. The absolutely crucial thing to understand here is that when families bury their wounds, their shame, and their history, that pain doesn't just evaporate into thin air. No, it remains highly active in the home's architecture, and it actively searches for a new person to inhabit. It literally demands a container to hold it. This brings us to part 2, the identified patient role. So, you might be wondering, how does the family choose this container? Well, unconsciously, narcissistic parents or grandparents will often pinpoint one specific child within the family system to bear the weight of their own unresolved issues, their denied shame, all those past traumas. The family basically points a collective finger and says, see, the problem isn't us, it's you. You end up becoming the living, breathing vessel for everything they absolutely refuse to look at. And here is the truly disturbing part, the twisted logic of righteous purification. The family system genuinely believes that by punishing and demonizing the scapegoat, they're actually cleansing the room of its sickness. In this incredibly warped reality, projecting all their dysfunction onto one child is seen as a righteous act. They systematically strip the scapegoat of their humanity just to keep their own false perfect image completely intact. They erase your identity so they can write their own fiction. But why you? Why were you chosen? If you were the scapegoat, you were probably told you were flawed, or difficult, or literally the reason the family was sick. But the clinical reality is actually the exact opposite. You were chosen because of your high vibrational frequency and your light. Your inherent personality fundamentally contradicted the narcissist's rigid needs. You see, scapegoats are frequently highly intuitive empaths. They're literally the strongest link in the family chain. Your innate ability to intuitively read the room completely threatened the family's unspoken rules of denial. Moving into part 3, the biology of trauma. Now we get into the fascinating, cutting-edge science of epigenetics. Trauma can actually be transmitted through genomic information. Extreme, prolonged stress modifies your gene expression, specifically through a biological process called DNA methylation. Now, it doesn't change your fundamental DNA sequence, but it flips the biological switches that govern your stress response. It is literally passing down molecular memories of trauma to the next generation. Let's break down the immense biological toll of this abuse. These epigenetic modifications directly impact stress regulatory genes. This leads to what's clinically called HPA axis dysregulation. In plain English, your brain's central stress response system gets permanently jammed on a hair trigger. This causes chronic cortisol imbalances and even accelerated cellular aging. So if you suffer from unexplained chronic pain, migraines, or just a constant feeling of being on edge, this completely validates your experience. Your body is quite literally keeping the score of the boiler room you grew up in. And sadly, this biological reality leads to a really heartbreaking clinical phenomenon known as conditioned fear, or terrifying transferences. Because your primordial past taught you that interconnectedness basically equals hurt, your biology reacts to new, healthy trust relationships with absolute terror. The very thing that could bring you healing, a safe, secure human connection, becomes the object of fear. Your nervous system has just been fundamentally conditioned to expect pain whenever you open up. That brings us to part 4. Reclaiming your emotional safety. To start reclaiming that safety, we first need to completely reframe your symptoms. Things like hypervigilance, having a survival radar constantly scanning the room for heavy footsteps, and anxious appeasement, which is the exhausting emotional labor of making yourself smaller to soothe an unpredictable parent. Listen to me. These are not weaknesses. They are incredibly intelligent, sophisticated survival adaptations developed by a child who is desperately trying to stay safe in a high-threat environment. Because you successfully developed these skills to survive, it's time to shift our vocabulary from victim to master alchemist. As a highly intuitive empath, You possess this unique, powerful ability to take that systemic darkness and toxic energy and actually transmute it into profound resilience and inner illumination. You have the proven capacity to clear the air of toxicity rather than just absorbing it like a sponge. So, what do the practical tools for this alchemy look like? First, make a daily, conscious choice to interrupt the legacy of pain. Second, consider researching your family history to uncover those hidden secrets. This profoundly helps depersonalize the abuse you suffered. And crucially, if you have to interact with energy vampires, deploy the gray rock technique. Become as boring, uninteresting, and non-reactionary as a literal gray rock sitting in a garden. If you choose to respond rather than react, you starve them of their narcissistic supply, and they're forced to look elsewhere for their fuel. Finally, Part 5, writing your new epilogue. This is maybe the most incredible, hopeful piece of science we have today regarding epigenetic reversibility. Just as extreme stress modifies your gene expression for the worse, positive experiences, a safe and supportive community, and really focused personal boundaries can actually tweak and correct those genetic trauma markers. You are not permanently broken. The science clearly shows us that your biology is highly responsive to the healing environment you consciously choose to create for yourself today. To help create that healing environment, our sources heavily recommend the GPS technique. GPS stands for Goals with Purpose that Drive Star Power. This is your ultimate focus tool to step completely out of family enmeshment, reclaim your stolen identity, and firmly channel your energy toward your own future rather than endlessly managing a toxic family's boiler room. Let's walk through exactly how to use GPS to reclaim your life. Step 1. Identify the personal values, principles, and passions that were buried by your family's projections. Step 2. Set incredibly focused intentions and goals based purely on those values. Step 3. Practice strict, unyielding personal boundaries to keep toxicity out. And Step 4. Actively channel and protect your own energy. Stop leaking your vital energy to emotional vampires and use it to drive your own vision forward. By choosing to break the cycle, you are already creating an incredible legacy of healing and resilience. Leaving that metaphorical overlook hotel behind is a massive, life-altering act of courage. When you interrupt the transmission of pain, you cease to be the identified patient, and you become a beacon of light that illuminates a whole new, healthy path for future generations. We've covered the clinical reality, the startling biology, and the actionable tools for reclaiming your emotional safety and your life. You are no longer bound by the destructive script handed to you by a dysfunctional system. You are the author now. So I'll leave you with this one profound question to think about today. What will be the very first sentence of your new story?
Fear, obligation, and guilt. These chains of OG trap you in toxic cycles, but you can break free. Embrace mindfulness and set healthy boundaries. Reclaim your autonomy.
Step number 1, point number 1, tool number 1, discontinue to carry the shame of the narcissistic parent.
Which of the following describes 3 clinical markers associated with hair-axis dysregulation in survivors of intergenerational trauma? C. Heightened cortisol sensitivity, a hair trigger stress response, and accelerated cellular aging.
If you take a mouse in a laboratory and you condition it to fear, the smell of cherry blossoms, like by pairing that scent with a mild electric shock, something completely impossible happens.
Right, the biology just takes over.
Yeah, exactly. That mouse will eventually have offspring. And those offspring who have never been shocked, who have never even encountered a cherry blossom in their lives, will exhibit this profound biological panic response the very first time they smell that scent.
It is wild.
It's mind-blowing, and incredibly, so will the grandchildren. The trauma doesn't just become a memory for that first mouse. It literally becomes a biological inheritance for generations that never even saw the laboratory.
And that really sets the stage for what we are looking at today.
It does. Welcome to today's deep dive into the source material. I want you to think about something. Have you ever felt like you are carrying around a heavyweight that isn't entirely yours?
Oh, I think a lot of people know that feeling.
Right. You know the feeling. It's like this constant, low-level, buzzing anxiety just in the background of your life. Or maybe a physical, nervous ache that you just can't logic your way out of.
Yeah, it defies logic completely.
It does. It feels like an echo from a family history that played out long before you were even born.
And It is a profoundly unsettling experience. I mean, when you are standing in the middle of that feeling, that inherited panic, the immediate overwhelming assumption is that there is something fundamentally wrong with you.
You just think you're broken.
Exactly. You assume that your brain is just broken. You think you are innately flawed because you are reacting to these threats that nobody else seems to see.
But what we are going to explore today, it completely dismantles that assumption. Your body isn't broken. It's actually functioning with terrifying efficiency.
Which is such an empowering shift in perspective.
It really is, and that is the core mission of this deep dive. Today, we are exploring a phenomenon known clinically as the transgenerational scapegoat cycle.
Now, I have a lot of ground to cover with this one.
We really do. We've got this massive stack of sources in front of us, ranging from, clinical psychology frameworks to historical analogies. And most crucially, this groundbreaking NIH-backed biological research that was published in the journal Nature.
The hard science on this is just fascinating.
It is. We are going to figure out exactly how families pass down unresolved pain, how one specific person gets drafted to become the family's identified patient, and most importantly, the massive plot twist in all this science.
Reversibility.
Yes, how this inherited biological trauma is absolutely reversible. Okay, let's unpack this.
So to even begin grasping the biological mechanisms here, we really have to understand the environment that triggers them in the first place.
Right, the origin point.
Yeah. We need a way to visualize the architecture of a dysfunctional family system. Because dysfunction isn't just, people yelling at each other in a room. It is a highly structured, very rigid system of emotional survival.
And to visualize that structure, our sources use one of the most famous haunted houses in cinematic history.
They do, and it works perfectly.
It really does. We are checking into the Overlook Hotel from Stanley Kubrick's film The Shining. But, and this is crucial for you listening, the clinical framework in our text uses this film not as a ghost story, but as a surprisingly accurate clinical roadmap of family trauma.
Right. They actually refer to it as the Overlook model of familial dysfunction.
Which is such a brilliant way to frame it.
It is. The reason the sources utilized this specific film is because Kubrick perfectly externalized what happens internally within an abusive system.
So how does the building itself map onto the psychology?
Well, let's look at the physical architecture of the hotel. It is grand. It is majestic. It represents high society. It presents this pristine, perfect image to the outside world.
Oh, I see. Like the perfect family on the block.
Exactly. Clinically, this represents the facade. This is the illusion of the happy family, the pillar of the community, the parents who go to PTA meetings and church and just seem completely put together to all their neighbors.
But the internal reality, like what it actually feels like to live inside that structure, that is represented by the boiler room down in the basement.
Yes, the boiler room is key here.
Our sources describe the family dynamic as this space of volatile, stagnated energy and misused ego. And if you think about how a boiler room works, it's a closed system generating immense heat and pressure.
And pressure always needs a release valve.
Right. If that pressure has nowhere to go, it's this constant looming threat of an explosion. Everyone living in the house has to silently manage that pressure.
And they have to manage it in total isolation, which brings us to the snowstorm in the film.
Oh, the snowstorm isn't just for dramatic effect.
Not at all. In the context of this clinical model, the snowstorm is not just bad weather. It is a deliberate, systemic mechanism of control.
Because abusers need to isolate their targets.
Exactly. Abusive environments rely on and actively cultivate social isolation. The snowstorm represents how abusers strategically cut their victims off from the outside world.
They trap them.
Yeah, they sever ties with extended family, they move away from support networks, they actively discourage outside friendships.
Because if you let outside air in, the reality check ruins the illusion. Like if someone from the outside sees the boiler room, the secret is out.
That is exactly it. If you are trapped in that kind of isolation, the abuser's reality becomes the only reality.
Which is terrifying for a kid.
It is. Because if a child has no external baseline for normal behavior, they adapt to the madness of the boiler room. It becomes their normal. So if we look at the characters in this environment as clinical symptoms rather than horror movie archetypes, the psychology gets incredibly fascinating.
Let's start with Danny, the son.
Okay, yes, Danny is a perfect example.
Because in pop culture, his ability, The Shining, it's treated like this cool supernatural power. Telepathy, seeing the future, talking without speaking.
Right, but the clinical analysis reframes this completely. Danny doesn't have magic. He has clinical hypervigilance.
Wow, okay, hypervigilance.
Yeah. When a child grows up in a dangerous, unpredictable home where the pressure could blow at any second, they don't develop superpowers. They develop an acute survival radar.
Because they have to, just to stay safe.
Precisely. They learn to instantly read the micro-expressions on a parent's face. They learn to interpret the weight, the cadence, and the intent of a caregiver's footsteps on the floorboards.
Okay, that makes total sense. Like, if Dad's footsteps sound a little too heavy, or if he pauses at the top of the stairs for 2 seconds too long, you know to hide in your closet before he even opens his mouth.
You are predicting the weather in the house.
You are anticipating systemic violence before it erupts. That's what seeing the blood in the elevator really is. It's not a ghost. It's a highly intelligent adaptation by a child whose nervous system is desperately trying to map out a threat.
And that adaptation takes a severe, severe toll on a developing brain.
Which brings us to Tony.
Yes, Tony. The little imaginary friend who lives in Danny's mouth and shows him things.
This part of the text really got me.
It's heavy. Clinically speaking, Tony represents a structural dissociative defense mechanism.
I love the analogy I thought of when I read this. It's like the brain is building a panic room for the child.
That is a very apt way to describe it. But we have to look at the mechanics of a panic room. It locks the threat out, yes.
Right.
But what happens to the person inside?
Oh, they are trapped. I mean, they survive the intruder, but if they stay in there forever, they starve.
Exactly. When the adults in a child's life completely fail to provide safety, the child's developing psyche fractures slightly to cope.
It has to split.
Yeah, it creates an inner protector, this dissociative wall that steps in to warn the child, to hide, to numb out, or to avoid certain dangers.
Because the parents are too consumed by their own chaos to do it.
Right. The brain steps in to parent the child. But by living in that dissociative panic room, the child is cut off from their own authentic emotional development. They are surviving, but they are psychologically confined.
Wow. That completely changes how I view those scenes. It's not creepy, it's just incredibly sad.
It really is.
Now, we really have to talk about Wendy, the mother, because reading this analysis, I actually felt a lot of guilt about how I used to view her character.
A lot of people do. The cultural narrative around her has been very harsh.
It has. For decades, audiences have dragged her. She's called weak, annoying, overly emotional, just this helpless, screamy victim. But the sources totally flipped the script on Wendy.
And it is a vital correction to how we view victims of systemic abuse in general.
So how do the sources view her?
If you analyze Wendy through the lens of trauma theory, she is not weak at all. She is engaging in a highly sophisticated survival strategy called anxious appeasement.
Anxious appeasement.
Yes. We often talk about fight or flight, but we forget about fawn.
Fawning, like walking on eggshells to keep the peace.
But it's more active than just walking on eggshells. Anxious appeasement is intense, exhausting emotional labor.
Oh, because she's actively managing him.
Exactly. It is the active strategy of constantly trying to soothe, flatter, and de-escalate an unpredictable, volatile partner to prevent that boiler from exploding.
Look at Wendy's body language in the first half of the film.
It tells the whole story.
She makes herself physically smaller. She apologizes for things that aren't her fault. She tries to anticipate every single one of Jack's needs before he even voices them.
And she isn't doing that out of inherent weakness. She is doing it because she is the only human pressure valve in that house.
She is managing his incredibly fragile ego to keep herself and her son alive.
And the absolute proof that it is a calculated survival strategy, and not just her being a weak person, is what happens when that strategy stops working.
The psychological switch flip.
Yes, the sources highlight this perfectly. Wendy is in total fawning, appeasement mode, right up until the exact second she realizes Danny is in immediate physical danger.
When she sees the bruises on his neck.
The fawning vanishes instantly. The switch flips from emotional labor to active physical defense.
She chooses safety over the illusion of the happy family.
Exactly. She grabs a baseball bat, she knocks him unconscious, she drags a grown man into a pantry and locks the door, and she plans an escape.
That requires immense decisive strength. It completely shatters the myth of the helpless victim.
It really does.
And then, of course, there's Jack, the guy wielding the axe.
Right.
The easy pop culture read is just, well, the haunted hotel made him crazy, or he's just an evil monster. But our clinical framework frames Jack as the ultimate representation of untreated generational trauma.
He is what happens when a person absolutely refuses to look inward.
Instead of facing his own wounds, his own failures, his own feelings of inadequacy, he projects all of that internal toxicity onto his family.
He becomes the cycle perpetrator.
The cycle perpetrator.
Yes, it is the tragic, violent reality of an adult who actively chooses not to break the cycle of their own dysfunction.
So the ghosts aren't really ghosts then?
In this framework, the ghosts in the hotel aren't spirits at all. They are the clinical echoes of buried pain. They are the history of violence demanding to be repeated because it was never processed.
Which leads to one of the most unsettling concepts in the text: historical erasure.
This part is fascinating.
Think about the final shot of the movie. The camera slowly zooms in on a photograph from a July 4th ball in 1921. And Jack is right there in the center of it.
Right, he's always been there.
And our sources point out this fascinating detail. In real life, Stanley Kubrick took an actual historical photograph and literally airbrushed a real man out of it just to paste Jack Nicholson's face in his place.
He literally erased someone else's history.
Yes. And the clinical analogy here is that narcissistic family systems do the exact same thing to their victims. They overwrite a person's true identity, wiping away who they really are, turning them into a blank slate.
And that historical erasure is the bedrock of how these families operate.
Why do they do it?
Because they cannot tolerate a child having an independent identity. They need that child to be a blank canvas.
A place to dump their own stuff?
Exactly. They need a place to project their own sickness, their own unfulfilled ambitions, or their own self-hatred. If the child has their own identity, the canvas isn't blank, and the projection doesn't work.
Wow. So for you listening, ask yourself, have you ever had to perform that anxious appeasement? Have you ever exhausted yourself, shrinking your own personality, burying your own needs, just to manage someone else's emotional boiler room?
It's a heavy question.
It is, because if you can visualize that dynamic, it forces a massive question. If the boiler room is constantly building pressure, physics dictates it has to blow eventually.
Unless there's a pressure valve.
Right. The family has to find a place to vent that toxicity, which forces them to make a subconscious choice about who takes the heat, how do they choose.
This is where we dive into systems theory, and specifically the clinical concept of the identified patient, or the IP.
Okay, the IP. Let's get into this.
In family systems theory, you don't look at individuals in a vacuum. You look at the family as a single biological organism.
Like they all share one nervous system.
Exactly. And a dysfunctional family system doesn't just randomly act out. The system unconsciously, and sometimes quite intentionally, selects one specific child to become the scapegoat.
They basically designate a human trash can for all their emotional garbage.
That's a very direct way to put it, yes. The scapegoat acts as a homeostatic mechanism.
Homeostatic, meaning what exactly in this context?
Homeostasis is a biological term for maintaining internal balance. If a body has toxins, the liver processes them so the rest of the body can survive.
So the scapegoat is the liver.
Yes. In a dysfunctional family, maintaining balance means the parents never have to look at their own collective wounds, their own shame, or their own secrets.
They just funnel it all into the scapegoat.
Right. By concentrating all of that systemic dysfunction into a single individual, the rest of the unit gets to avoid the excruciating labor of healing. They point at the scapegoat and say, "We aren't sick, you are."
And what really struck me in the reading was the twisted logic the family uses to rationalize this.
Oh, the rationalization is deep.
They aren't sitting around twirling their mustaches thinking, let's emotionally destroy this child. In their warped reality, they view this abuse as a form of righteous purification.
It is a complete inversion of reality.
The sources actually compared this dynamic to another horror classic, Carrie.
Yes. Margaret White in Carrie is the textbook example of extreme projection.
She is terrifying.
She is. She harbors this dark, repressed, quote-unquote, satanic internal world regarding her own trauma and sexuality, but confronting that would destroy her fragile ego.
So she just projects all of that internal filth onto her daughter.
Exactly. She demonizes Carrie to justify her own religious martyrdom. She truly believes that by punishing Carrie, she is striking down evil.
So by sacrificing the scapegoat, the family feels like they're cleansing the room of their own sickness. They strip the identified patient of their humanity and view them as this unclean vessel.
It's a brutal process.
It is. But here is where I get really stuck. Let's say there are 3 kids in a family. Why that specific child?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right. If they just need a liver to process the toxins, wouldn't a narcissistic parent just pick the weakest, most compliant kid? The one who won't fight back?
That is the logical assumption.
Yeah.
But the clinical reality is completely counterintuitive.
Really?
Yes. The scapegoat is rarely the weakest link. In fact, they are almost always selected because they are the strongest link in the family chain.
Okay, wait. That doesn't make sense to me. Wouldn't a narcissistic parent want the strongest, brightest kid to be their golden child? Like, to show off to the neighbors like a trophy. Why destroy your best asset?
Because you have to look at what constitutes strength in this context. We aren't
Yes.
talking about athletic ability or getting good grades.
What are we talking about then?
We are talking about emotional intuition. The chosen child is frequently a highly intuitive empath. They have an innate structural personality that is rooted in authenticity.
Oh, they can spot the lies.
Exactly. They can see the emperor has no clothes.
Mm-hmm.
Because they are highly perceptive, their very existence fundamentally contradicts the unspoken rules of the narcissistic parent's delusion.
Oh, I see. Because they can read the room, because their intuition picks up on the dysfunction that everyone else is ignoring, they are an absolute threat to the family's lies.
They are a massive threat.
The compliance of the weak kid is comforting, but the intuition of the strong kid is dangerous.
Precisely. This connects to a crucial psychological concept called parental mentalization failure.
Mentalization failure. Let's break that down.
Mentalization, which is also known as reflective functioning, is a person's ability to understand their own mental states and, crucially, to accurately imagine the mental states of others.
So it's basically empathy in action.
Right. It's the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes. Narcissistic parents severely lack this capability. They cannot accurately read their children.
So what happens when they face this highly intuitive kid?
When they encounter a child who has high intuitive alertness, a child who looks at them and essentially sees right through the facade, it sets off massive internal alarm bells for the parent. The parent feels exposed.
And instead of doing the emotional work to heal whatever the child just exposed, the parent goes on the offensive.
They attack the threat.
They try to consume that child's light to fuel their own false image, and it puts the child in this completely impossible double bind called parentification.
And we really need to clarify what parentification means here.
Yeah, because I hear parentification a lot in wellness blogs, and it usually means like a kid who had to cook dinner for their siblings or pay the bills because the parents were absent. But the sources are talking about emotional parentification, right?
Yes. Instrumental parentification is cooking dinner. Emotional parentification is far more insidious.
How so?
The child is forced into a dual, highly contradictory role. On one hand, they are the identified patient. They are constantly devalued, demonized, and told they are the root of all the family's problems.
But on the other hand,
the parents heavily rely on this exact same child to act as their emotional regulator. The child is expected to parent their own parents.
Oh.
They have to soothe their fragile egos, manage their explosive outbursts, essentially perform the anxious appeasement we saw with Wendy.
Think about the sheer, staggering cognitive dissonance that must cause a developing brain.
It's enough to break anyone.
You are 7 years old. You are being told every single day that you are the sickness ruining the family, that you are bad, that you are the problem. Meanwhile, you are actively functioning as the only immune system trying to heal the family.
You are holding the whole system together.
You are blamed for the mess while you are the only one holding the broom. It's psychological torture.
It is deeply destabilizing. It fractures the child's sense of self because their internal reality, their deep knowledge that they are helping, is constantly being overridden by the family's gaslighting, which insists they are harming.
And this psychological grooming is devastating enough on its own. I mean, if the sources stopped right there, it would be a profound deep dive.
But they don't stop there.
No, they don't. The sources reveal something even more shocking. This trauma doesn't just live in the mind as bad memories. It gets coded into the flesh and bone.
This is where we shift from psychology to hard biology.
The NIH research.
Yes. We are looking at research funded by the National Institutes of Health and published in the journal Nature. We are talking about the science of epigenetics and the biological transmission of trauma.
Okay, before we get into the weeds of the DNA, I need to establish some definitions from the text because I definitely use these terms interchangeably before I read this stack.
A lot of people do. It's confusing.
What is the actual scientific difference between intergenerational trauma and transgenerational trauma?
It's a critical distinction to make. Intergenerational trauma refers to transmission that happens through direct behavioral observation and grooming between a parent and a child.
Okay, so it's behavioral.
Right. It's the psychological impact of being raised by someone who is traumatized. You observe their poor coping styles, their emotional silence, their sudden volatility, and you adapt your behavior to survive them.
So that's the direct experience of the environment. You learn it by being in the room with them.
Right. But transgenerational trauma spans multiple generations, say from a grandparent to a grandchild. And it involves biological transmission that completely bypasses direct experience.
Bypass, so they don't even have to meet.
Exactly. The grandchild doesn't need to have ever met the grandparent or even know their story to inherit the biological adaptations to that grandparent's trauma, like the mice we discussed at the very beginning.
That is wild. Okay, so how does that actually work mechanically? Because when people hear this, the immediate question is, are we saying trauma literally mutates our DNA?
That's the first thing everyone asks.
Right. Does it change our genetic code? If my grandfather went through a war, does my DNA sequence literally change?
No, the actual sequence of the DNA, the nucleotides, the A, C, T, and G letters of your genetic code, that does not change.
Okay, so what is happening?
Epigenetics is the study of how your behaviors and environment can cause changes that affect the way your genes work. Extreme stress causes a chemical process called DNA methylation.
Okay, methylation. I want to spend some time here. Mechanically, what is happening at the cellular level?
Think of your DNA as a massive grand piano.
Okay, I like this analogy.
The keys in the piano are your genes. The sequence of the keys never changes. But epigenetics is the sheet music that tells the cell which keys to play, how loudly to play them, and which ones to ignore entirely.
So the sheet music can be rewritten.
Yes. DNA methylation is the process where tiny chemical tags, these methyl groups, physically attach themselves to the outside of the gene. These tags act like volume knobs.
Volume knobs?
Yeah, they can turn the expression of a gene all the way up, or they can mute it completely by blocking the cell's machinery from reading that piece of DNA.
So the keys on the piano are the exact same, but the instructions on how to read them have been altered by trauma. The song sounds completely different.
Exactly. And the NIH research highlights specific targets for this methylation. The sources specifically mention the FKBP5 and NR3C1 genes.
Those sound very technical. What do they do?
These are not random genes. They are primary stress regulatory genes. When extreme trauma alters these genes, it completely dysregulates the HPA axis.
Okay, the HPA axis. I hear that thrown around a lot in wellness spaces regarding adrenal fatigue and burnout, but mechanically, what is that actually doing in the body?
The HPA axis stands for the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. It is your body's central alarm system.
The alarm system, got it.
When your brain perceives a threat, the hypothalamus releases a hormone that tells the pituitary gland to sound the alarm. The pituitary gland sends a signal to your adrenal glands, which sit on top of your kidneys, telling them to flood your body with cortisol and adrenaline.
That's the classic fight or flight response.
Exactly. Your heart rate spikes, your digestion stops, blood rushes to your muscles so you can run or fight.
Which is great if you were being chased by a bear.
Exactly. It's a lifesaver. But when those specific genes we mentioned are methylated due to chronic childhood trauma, the HPA axis becomes structurally hypersensitive.
Oh, it gets stuck.
Right. The negative feedback loop that is supposed to turn the alarm off gets broken. It leads to severe cortisol imbalances. The survivor inherits a permanent biological hair trigger stress response.
A hair trigger.
Yeah, their baseline for perceiving a threat is drastically lowered.
I found a fascinating nuance in the sources regarding how this biological expectation of threat gets passed down from mother to child. It talked about the mechanical difference between trauma happening during a pregnancy versus trauma happening before a pregnancy.
This is a crucial biological mechanism to understand.
Let's walk through it.
If a mother experiences severe trauma while she is pregnant, the developing fetus is directly exposed to that stress environment.
Because they share a blood supply.
Yes, the baby is sharing the mother's blood supply, which means the baby's developing nervous system is being bathed in the mother's cortisol and adrenaline.
Oh, wow.
So the mother's DNA doesn't necessarily need to be altered for the baby to be affected, because the baby was essentially in the room when the trauma happened.
But if the trauma happens before she ever even conceives a child, like years before,
if the trauma occurs years before conception, the only way for that biological expectation of threat to reach the next generation is through those epigenetic markers.
It has to go through the DNA.
Right. Changes in the mother's DNA, the methylation we talked about, become a biological necessity for transmission. The body literally alters the epigenetic blueprint of the egg itself.
That is just astonishing to think about.
It attaches those methyl groups to the DNA inside the egg to say, the world you're going to be born into is incredibly dangerous. I survived it, but you need your HPA axis armed and ready on day one.
So you are literally born with molecular memories of a war you never fought.
It's a tragic but brilliant evolutionary defense.
And this isn't just invisible psychological stress. It manifests in devastating physical ways.
The physical toll is immense.
The text lists things like accelerated cellular aging, meaning your telomeres shorten faster, making your cells biologically older than your chronological age.
Yes, your body is wearing out faster.
It mentions sex-specific genetic patterns, meaning trauma might show up differently in a son versus a daughter based on the lineage. And it brings on severe chronic pain, chronic migraines, and intense digestive issues. The body keeps the score.
It absolutely does. The biology is trying to communicate a historical truth that the family system is desperately trying to deny.
The family secrets are literally stored in the gut.
Exactly. The stomach aches, the migraines, the panic attacks, that is the body screaming the truth that the family has forbidden the child to speak.
If you are listening to this right now and you have ever felt like your anxiety is a biological mandate rather than a personal failing, this science is your validation.
You are not crazy.
You are not. You are not weak. Your body is reacting exactly the way it was designed to. It is reacting to a world your ancestors barely survived.
It is a profound shift in perspective. You stop asking, what is wrong with me? And you finally start asking, what happened to my family?
Exactly. So let's look at the trajectory here. We have a child who has been psychologically groomed as a scapegoat, told they are the problem, parentified to manage the explosive adult, and on top of that, biologically wired through their HPA axis for extreme hypervigilance.
It's a massive burden to carry into adulthood.
It really is. What happens when this child grows up, becomes an adult, leaves the Overlook Hotel, and tries to go out into the real world to form their own healthy relationships?
The clinical reality is that it is often incredibly difficult. And the sources rely on the work of psychoanalyst Lawrence E. Hedges to explain why. He introduces a concept called terrifying transferences.
Okay, this section of the text was heavy, but it explains so much about self-sabotage in relationships. Unpack terrifying transferences for us.
To understand this, we have to look at how human beings are biologically wired for connection in the first place.
Right.
An infant's primordial interconnectedness with their caregiver is supposed to be the absolute foundation of safety. It's how we regulate our nervous systems.
We co-regulate with our parents.
Exactly. But for the child in a narcissistic abusive system, that connection was consistently met with pain, betrayal, unpredictability, or emotional starvation.
It wasn't safe.
No. So through simple, brutal Pavlovian conditioning, the trust relationship itself becomes the object of terror.
The trust relationship itself is the terror, because the very people who were supposed to keep you safe were the ones hurting you. Your nervous system essentially codes a new rule.
Connection equals danger.
Vulnerability equals death.
Yes. And this creates a profound breach in interpersonal skills in adulthood. When the adult survivor tries to connect with someone, even a totally safe person like a loving romantic partner, a supportive friend, or even a therapist, they don't feel relief.
What do they feel?
They experience what Hedges calls a clamor of overwhelming distress.
A clamor. It's like a fire alarm going off because you turned on the toaster. The safe person unwittingly becomes the target of these massive biological defense mechanisms.
And what's fascinating here is how the brain's sincere attempt to protect the survivor actually isolates them from the very support base they so desperately need to heal.
They push people away to stay safe.
Right. The survivor feels this rising tide of panic when things are going well, because peace feels like a trick. Peace means the other shoe is about to drop.
Right, because in the boiler room, quiet just meant the pressure was building.
Exactly. If someone is being kind to them, their hyper-vigilant brain says, what is their angle? How are they going to use this against me?
And if that wasn't hard enough, the sources also talk about how this grooming creates specific subconscious programming. They say that children groomed by cluster B personalities, like narcissists or borderlines, develop a very specific subconscious operating program by the age of 7.
The first 7 years of life are when the brain's fundamental operating system is installed.
That's a huge window.
It is. Your attachment style, your sense of worth, your understanding of love, it all gets coded then. If your operating system was coded by an abuser, your subconscious learns to seek out the familiar.
Even if it's painful.
Especially if it's painful. Unresolved childhood trauma acts as what the text calls portals and gateways.
Portals and gateways. It sounds almost sci-fi, but it's just the brain repeating patterns, right?
Right. The brain prefers familiar misery to unfamiliar peace. These gateways cause the adult to unconsciously seek out romantic partners, bosses, or friends who mimic the predatory nature of their parents.
So you just end up recreating the Overlook Hotel wherever you go.
The survivor have been groomed to believe that love requires self-sacrifice, that connection requires endless appeasement. So they end up continuing the cycle of codependency, unconsciously inviting new abusers into their lives because it matches their internal map of reality.
And the sources use some incredibly vivid terminology to describe these types of partners.
They really do go there.
They call them energy vampires who literally drink the tears and eat the flesh of their prey. Now, I have to push back here a little bit.
Go ahead.
Energy vampire feels like one of those buzzy pop psychology terms you see on TikTok. Is there actual clinical weight to this? Or is it just a dramatic way of saying someone is a jerk?
It sounds dramatic,
Yeah.
but it describes a very real mechanical transaction. Emotional abuse is visceral. Narcissistic personalities operate on extraction.
Extraction. Okay, explain that.
Clinically, they suffer from a hollow core. They cannot generate their own sense of self-worth, and they cannot internally regulate their own negative emotions. They thrive on chaotic, low-vibrational energy.
So they need someone else to process it for them.
Because they cannot regulate themselves, they have to siphon emotional regulation from an external target.
So when they provoke you into an argument, they aren't just being mean. They are literally offloading their internal anxiety onto you, forcing you to process it for them.
Precisely. They actively try to drain the survivor's energy field. And if they succeed, they leave the survivor in what the text calls a despondent sunken place.
A sunken place.
It's a state of total enmeshment, where you completely lose your own identity. You don't know where you end and the narcissist begins. You become an extension of their ego, just like you were for your parents.
And this is why breaking away is so excruciating. You aren't just leaving a bad relationship. You are fighting against your own biological conditioning, your subconscious programming from age 7, and a partner who is actively trying to consume your remaining emotional energy. It feels impossible.
It feels impossible. And sadly, many people spend their whole lives trapped in that exact loop.
Okay, I know. This picture sounds incredibly grim. We're dealing with epigenetic markers, trauma inherited from ancestors, subconscious programming locked in during childhood, hyperreactive HPA axes, and people trying to extract our emotional energy.
It is a lot to take in.
It is. But this is where the deep dive gives us the massive plot twist. This is where we get to the solutions. Because the absolute most important takeaway from all these sources is this. None of this is a life sentence. None of this is permanent.
That is the crucial clinical pivot. We are not doomed by our biology, and we are not doomed by our history.
Which is such a relief.
It is. The very same NIH-supported studies that confirm the existence of epigenetic markers caused by trauma also confirm their reversibility.
Reversibility. That is the key word of the entire day. How? How do we biologically reverse genetic markers?
It comes down to neuroplasticity and targeted clinical care. Just as extreme chronic stress can methylate DNA and dysregulate the HPA axis, positive, emotionally safe experiences and specific trauma-informed therapies can effectively remove those methyl groups and reverse those epigenetic marks.
So we can literally rewire it.
Yes, the brain and the nervous system can literally be reconfigured.
The text highlights 2 specific therapies, EMDR and somatic experiencing. Since we have the time, I really want to dig into the mechanics of these. Why these 2 therapies specifically? What are they doing differently than just sitting on a couch and talking about your childhood?
Traditional talk therapy engages the prefrontal cortex, which is the logical, reasoning part of your brain. But trauma isn't stored as logic.
It's stored as feeling.
Exactly. It's stored in the amygdala and the nervous system as raw sensory data. EMDR, which stands for Eye Movement Desensitization and Reprocessing, is specifically designed to bypass the logic center and access those molecular memories where they actually live.
How does it do that? Like, what does a session actually look like?
It uses bilateral stimulation. Usually, the therapist will have you track their fingers moving back and forth across your field of vision, or they will use little buzzers in your hands that alternate left and right.
Left and right. Why is that important?
This bilateral movement crosses the midline of the brain, forcing the left and right hemispheres to communicate. The working theory is that this mimics what happens during REM sleep.
Rapid eye movement sleep, when we dream and process our days.
Exactly. During REM sleep, our brain files away memories. But traumatic memories get stuck. They don't get filed away, they stay active, which is why a flashback feels like the trauma is happening right now, not 20 years ago.
It hasn't been archived.
Right. EMDR uses that bilateral stimulation to help the brain finally process the memory, neutralize the highly charged emotions, and physically move the memory from the amygdala, the panic center, into the hippocampus, the historical archive.
So it takes the memory out of the active threat folder and files it away in the past events folder. It stops the fire alarm from going off every time you remember something. That is incredible.
It is highly effective.
And what about somatic experiencing? How is that different?
Somatic experiencing focuses directly on the body. Remember, the trauma is stored in the nervous system. The HPA axis is stuck in overdrive.
Right, the hair trigger.
Somatic therapy recognizes that animals in the wild who survive a threat will physically shake off the excess adrenaline to reset their nervous system. Humans, especially children in abusive homes, are often forced to suppress that physical release. They get stuck in a freeze response.
Because if you shake or cry, the abuser will just hit you again. You have to swallow the panic.
Exactly. Somatic therapy helps the patient safely release that conditioned fear from the body. It tracks physical sensations like a tightness in the chest or a knot in the stomach and slowly teaches the nervous system how to complete the fight or flight cycle that got frozen during childhood.
It lets the body finish what it started.
Yes. It biologically re-regulates the cortisol levels by finally letting the body know that the danger has passed.
So you were literally using targeted therapy to turn those epigenetic volume knobs back down.
Literally down-regulating the stress response.
But the sources also give us some very practical everyday tools for dealing with these toxic family members while we are doing this heavy biological healing. Because you still have to navigate life.
Yes, you need boundaries in the meantime.
My favorite concept in the text is the gray rock technique, but I want to make sure I understand it. If my body is hardwired to react, and the narcissist wants my reaction to feed on, my instinct is to fight back and defend myself.
That is everyone's instinct.
But the sources suggest fighting back is exactly what they want, so what's the alternative? Playing dead.
Playing dead is a good analogy, but gray rock is specifically about making yourself completely indigestible to an emotional predator.
Indigestible, I love that.
The goal of a narcissist is to elicit a reaction from you. Anger, tears, defense, even a lengthy explanation of your feelings. That reaction is their supply. It's the fuel they need to regulate their own emptiness.
So if you fight back, you are still feeding them. You are still playing their game.
Precisely. To use gray rock, you become as entirely uninteresting, non-reactionary, and emotionally flat as a gray rock on the ground.
How do you actually do that in a conversation?
When they try to provoke you, you do not defend yourself. You do not explain your position. You give short, non-committal answers. Okay, I see.
You just give them nothing.
You show absolutely no emotion. You don't make eye contact.
Starve them.
You starve them of their supply. Eventually, the energy vampire realizes they cannot extract any emotional fuel from you, and they are forced to look elsewhere to feed. It is a highly effective energy shield.
And once you have protected your energy with gray rock, you have to rebuild who you actually are. Because remember, the family subjected you to historical erasure. They wiped your identity to make you a blank slate.
The blank canvas needs to be painted.